first of all, I would like to thank everybody for coming tonight. Thanks so much. It's great to see everybody. Thank you. And I also want to thank the Town of Burlingame Parks and Recreation Department. They let us use this amazing facility. This was not here 10 years ago, and it's just absolutely spectacular. So thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Burlingame Parks and Rec. Now, my name is Jason Pelletier, and I've been a resident of Hillsborough and Burlingame for the past 15 years. And I've had the good fortune to kind of go on an unexpected adventure with some of our neighbors. Now, not all of you, but the furry ones, the ones that live in our parks, in our neighborhoods, even in our backyards, believe it or not. And they live on the fringes. They live in the dark. They come out at night. They want very little to do with us, so we don't often know that they're there. But tonight I'm going to share their stories with you. I hope you'll be entertained sometimes, perhaps enlightened, and I hope moved enough to take some simple actions that we can do to coexist with the animals that live in and around our community. Now, I've worked in conservation for the last 20 years, for the last 15 with the Nature Conservancy in California. So I hope that what I share to you tonight with you tonight is mostly based in good science and biology, but I will make some leaps and draw some conclusions and share some opinions that are mine and mine alone. They're not my employer, they're not another organization, and they're not the city of Burlingame. I'd also like to ask, we'll have Q&A at the end, but I have about 45 minutes of content to get through, and I promise you the last 20 is what most of you are here for, not lions. So if we get through the early stuff, then we'll make sure we get to that, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So it's probably no surprise to any of you if you're here tonight that our planet is in trouble. Climate change is causing floods and fires and droughts all over the world. And you literally can't go anywhere on this planet and get away from plastic. They're finding plastic in the ice of Antarctica, in the deepest trenches of the ocean, the Marianas Trench in the Pacific, even in the Himalayas, and in the bodies of whales and birds and fish and even us. Now that's bad news for us. But it's even worse for the animals that we share the planet with. Scientists predict that if we don't change things, fully 1 million species that we know could go extinct by 2100. And that's 1/4 of all the known species on the planet if we don't do anything. Now, the main reason for that is habitat loss. We keep growing, and as does our demand for fuel and food and fiber. There's simply not enough natural land left out there to support all the animals that live with us. So what that means is that if we want them around, we all have to get better at living with them in our farms, in our forests, and yes, even in our communities and our backyards. So if you believe that and you buy into that, so what do you do? Like, how do you know what to do? Historically, scientists would go out and they'd spend a couple years camped out in a tent somewhere and looking at some animal, specific animal, and they'd learn all about it. And they'd publish what they learned in a journal, or sometimes they'd give it to a government agency that would make its way down to us. And if they got really lucky and they found something really super cool, they'd end up on like David Attenborough or something like that. But that left huge gaps in what we know about what animals need and what they do. And so scientists develop all these models, complex computer models, that allow us to predict where they're going to be and what they need at any point in time. And when you're sitting there at your computer, they look great. But when you put a collar on your first animal and you watch where it actually goes, it's often 100% different than what the models predict. But 10 years ago, a revolution in conservation started. And that revolution was actually in technology. So finally, animals can tell us directly what they need. We have sensors that are so light, you can put them on the wings of a monarch butterfly, and we can follow their migration patterns up and down North America and figure out where they stop for food. We have game cameras that you can drop in the most remote place in California. They'll last for weeks on battery or even on a solar panel, and they'll beam their images and their video up to the cloud, either through the cell networks or even satellites. And then, of course, if you follow next door, you know that we all have game cameras on our house now. Now, they're usually pointed out at the bad people walking up and down our streets, but they also serve equally well to capture the lives of animals. Now, these three things generate huge amounts of data that would take lifetimes for people to sort through. So now we have AI, and you can tell AI, I'm looking for this kind of animal in this place, exhibiting this behavior, and it literally can scan through thousands of hours of footage in minutes and pick out what you're looking for. So a few years ago, in the teeth of COVID, my family, we decided to move from Burlingame to Hillsborough. And we bought a property that quite honestly was a mess. We had brush and down trees and poison oak, 40 years of accumulation. You couldn't even go on over half the property. Certainly we got the call almost right away from Central County Fire, and they were like, hey, you got a big problem there, you have to clean up, and we got to work. So for most people that would be a nightmare, but as you might imagine for me, it was an opportunity. So I bought a cheap game camera on Amazon, and I stuck it back there. And for the first month or so, you got what you'd expect: raccoons and possums, skunks, squirrels, rats. Until one morning I woke up and I saw this character staring back at me. This beautiful bobcat on the edge of our property. And so I said, well, if that's there, maybe there are more. And so I put up another camera, and another, and another, and another. And I literally had no idea the tip of the iceberg that I had uncovered in the drama that would unfold in front of these cameras. And that's what I want to share with you tonight, is a lens into the world of these animals through 6 or 7 cameras on a half-an-acre of land in Hillsborough. So now I'm going to start with the little guys, and I know they're not that exciting, but they still have some amazing stories to tell. And I'm going to start with perhaps the least attractive of any of them, the Virginia possum. It's not even a native animal to this part of the world. They come from the East Coast, Midwest, down into Central America. But they're here because people brought them here. In the 1910s and the 1920s, people moving to find better times from the East Coast to the West, they had nothing, and these animals were good food. I've read about it, I've never tried one, but supposedly they taste like chicken with an aftertaste of catfish. No thanks, but that's how they got here. That's how they got to the West Coast, and they've since made a home here. But there's another interesting part of opossums, is that they're marsupials. And what that means is that they have their babies, they're smaller than the tip of your finger, your pinky, and they crawl into a pouch in mom's underside, and there they live for about 6 weeks. Until they get too big for that pouch, and then something else happens, and that resulted in one of the strangest videos I've ever captured. When I first saw this, I thought, that opossum has tumors, it's radioactive, there's something wrong with it. But you'll see what happens once those babies get too big for that pouch. And by the way, they're the only marsupials in North America. So they're the same as kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and all those weird ones in Australia. We only have one in North America, and it's this animal. But here's what happens when the babies outgrow mom's pouch. They hitch a ride. And look at this poor mom. I mean, she can barely walk anymore with all these animals on her back. So I kind of like this because there's a through line through this whole presentation, which is how hard mother animals work to raise the next generation. And this is just the first example of that. And for all you moms out there, sure you're gonna have a lot of empathy for some of these other moms that we'll see later on. So next on to our friend the raccoon, who most of us know for getting in our trash or getting in a fight with our dogs. But before we were here, they were actually semi-aquatic animals. They had incredible feelings and dexterity in their fingers, and that's because they stick them under the water in muddy ponds, and they dig in the mud, and they find their food without being able to see, without having to see. And so that's how they experience the world, is through their sense of touch and their paws. And you'll see a bunch of raccoons doing just that in this next clip. So here we have Mom with her merry band of hooligans, and you'll see that they are just exploring every little nook and cranny, looking for something. And I want you to focus on this guy here, because he finds something, or she, something really interesting, a little bug, and learns a hard lesson. Which is don't mess with stink bugs. So a lot of these animals, they learn what they learn from Mom, but in this case, he's learning on the job. It's a hard night getting shot in the face by a stink bug. So finally, in the kind of low end of the pyramid here are the striped skunk, and I'm not going to talk about this one just yet because he or she makes a guest appearance a little bit later that's much more interesting. All right. So now we get to the middle, the mesocarnivores, the middle of the food chain. So they're bigger than the ones we just talked about. They're certainly not up there with the coyotes, or I'm sorry, the mountain lions. But we're starting to get into the territory where if you have pets or kids, you get a little bit worried about these animals. Now, one of the cool things, so this is the bobcat, that's where I'm going to start. They're in the lynx family. Lynx are only in the upper kind of northern North America, Canada, Minnesota, anywhere where there's snow and rabbits. So we only have bobcats here, but they're related. And how many do we have? So bobcats and mountain lions, the way that they divide up the world is the females establish a territory. They will keep everybody else, all the other females out, will often fight, sometimes to the death if they need to. But they carve out their little slice of paradise, and in this case, usually around 1.5 square miles. And so in the 12 square miles of Burlingame and Hillsborough, we might have 8, 9 female bobcats if they occupied every square inch. The males do the same thing, but they have a slightly bigger territory so that they overlap with multiple females. And that's kind of how they go about their lives. And so if you're looking at the totality of Burlingame, Hillsborough, parts of Millbrae, we might have 10 animals plus or minus. And so there are not that many of them, but you see them around because they are pretty active and they move around quite a bit. Now, you've probably seen a lot of game camera photos, and I actually like video because you can start to, number one, you see what animals are doing, but you can actually see their personalities and their individual characteristics. And here we have the top cat in his little stretch of Hillsborough, the big dominant male, and he comes walking down the steps and doesn't care that he's in our yard or that the camera's looking him in the face. In fact, this animal uses the light and the camera to hunt. And so that's how he acts. But next is a new interloper, the young cat on the block who's scared of the big guy, doesn't like our yard, and certainly doesn't like the camera. And he ends up going back up the steps and the other way. So once again, scaredy cat does not like the camera and goes the other direction. And the big one, who takes one look at it right there and just kind of wanders off and does his thing. So it's kind of neat that with the video you can actually start to differentiate like individuals and how they kind of work through the yard. Now, I probably have 100 days of bobcats over the past 4 years in our yard, and only 2 did we see them during the day. So that's kind of big lesson number 1 here, is if we're all trying to avoid conflicts with wildlife, 95 or more % of the time, they're out in the dark at night. And so if you keep your pets inside during the night, that avoids 95% of the bad things that can happen. But this clip I wanted to show because it shows why they get their name. With his little white tail. And they can be still. I don't understand it because they can be like dead still looking at a mouse and trying to catch it, and their tail will still be kind of going back and forth. And then this one here, he graced us with his presence and kind of chilled out for about 10 minutes right in front of the camera. And I like this one just because it shows how kind of beautiful and distinct they are. Like, to me, these animals, they give any leopard or jaguar a run for their money in terms of their spots and their coloring. Especially when they look right into the camera. I mean, come on. So, what do they eat? If you have pets, you have to worry about bobcats. And the answer is generally no, because this is their favorite food in the world. So if you have bobcats in your yard, your squirrel problem would go away. Because that's what they're eating mostly, squirrels and rats and mice and small rodents. And they're not that big. They're furry, but they're not that big. So they weigh like 10, 12, 15 pounds maybe. So unless you have rabbits or chickens, which I would advise putting in at night, they're really not going to be a big problem for our pets or our kids or us. You can't say the same about our friend the coyote. And if any of you are on next door, there's a whole explosion going on as we speak about packs of coyotes that are kind of scary and kind of getting up in people's grill. And that can be true. They're big. They can weigh up to 40, 50 pounds sometimes. They're incredibly intelligent, and I feel like if you look in this one's eyes, you can kind of see that intelligence looking back at you. Some might even say cunning. They're fearless. Like, once they get accustomed to people, they lose their fear because they learn. And they come out during the day once they start to lose that fear. So all of those things put them in more conflict with what we're trying to do than all the other animals that we'll see tonight. So how do you avoid that? Well, number one, don't feed wildlife. We have a neighbor who feeds feral cats. And if you go up there, the minute she puts the food down, the vultures come out, the raccoons come scurrying from the bushes, and if you go out there right after dark, you'll see coyotes as well. So number one, that's how they get habituated to people, is if you feed them. Number two, walk your dogs on leashes, so that often what happens is a dog will run after a coyote, and then the coyote will turn around and something bad will happen. So leashes. And finally, if you do run into one that doesn't seem like it's that afraid, don't back down, make yourself big, make a lot of noise, look it in the eye, and chances are even the most brazen coyotes will go away. So how many do we have around? You would think they're everywhere, especially if you're in social media. But the pairs, they have territories of like 2 to 4 square miles, and you're like, well, why are the pairs with babies smaller than the individuals? And that's because they're such effective hunters when they're together. They don't need a lot of territory to make a living. So there's 2 to 4 square miles per coyote pair, which means that maybe we have like 3 or 4 pairs in the Burlingame, Hillsborough neighborhood. And when they separate, so the pair will have some pups and they grow up, and eventually mom and dad will kick them out to go, have the next generation. And when that happens, all of a sudden you have these young individual animals wandering around. And that's when they get into trouble, because they're looking for territory, they're not as good at hunting, they don't have the backup of their spouse, and they have much bigger territory. So that's why it's bigger here. So on average, I would say that like every big open space area in our community, Mills Canyon, the open space near Sky Farm in Hillsborough, kind of Crystal Springs and San Mateo Creek downstream, and even over here on the beachfront, if you have 5 to 10 acres of open land, chances are there's going to be a pair of coyotes there. And that's just the reality. We can take them away, and new ones will move in because they're always spreading as I'm showing here, when they have a new generation. Now, I just show these pictures because they are beautiful animals, like the coloring and how they looked. And then this one, you know, you just, I don't know,
That's so cute.
there's something looking back at you with those eyes that's not like the other animals here. So now I'm going to start to flip the coin and talk a bit more about what happens to them when they live with us. And this is a young coyote. When I first saw this, I was like, somebody put a collar on it. It must be a wildlife agency trying to track it or something like that. And I posted on Nextdoor. I will regret that forever for reasons I'll share in a moment. Just looking for like, hey, does anybody know? Are they doing a coyote study around us? But if you look at this a little more carefully, what you'll see is that this young coyote got a piece of PVC garden pipe stuck around its neck. And so, of course, everybody on Nextdoor, they want to help, but they want to camp out in our yard, and they want to set up traps there and stay there for a week. And we had people posting flyers on our fence and our neighbor's fence, and big fights erupted between people and everything. And it was all from a good place. It was all like people who really worried about this animal and what's going to happen to it. But I captured another video that gave me some reassurance that maybe this animal was plucky enough and healthy enough that it could very well make its way through. And here it is. So what happened here a few hours later is this coyote caught a mole. And if it was starving and desperate, I think it would have eaten it right away, but instead it said, hey, I'm going to have a great time, and I'm going to play with it for a while first. And I challenge any of you, if I had video editing skills and I could paint this coyote yellow and swap out the mole for a tennis ball, you'd be hard-pressed to recognize the difference between this animal and the dogs that we all live with and love. So kind of watching this one go for it gave me some hope that maybe it had a few steps and some life after all. Now the next one here is a bit sadder of a tale, but probably one of the two most important things that we could all come away with today. So this is another young dispersing coyote exploring for new territory. And you can see here, it looks great. I mean, it's beautiful, it's fluffy, it has a lot of meat on its bones. But over the course of a few months, it came back a few times, and every time it looked worse and worse and worse, until it eventually looked like this.
Oh my gosh.
And this poor coyote had mange. And now, if you've ever followed coyotes, you kind of know, like, oh, it's a mangy coyote, it must be a natural thing that they get. It's not natural. What happened to this coyote is that it's young, it didn't know how to hunt well, and so what it instead relied on were rats and squirrels and mice that had been poisoned by rat poison. And not just any rat poison, but a particular kind that has anticoagulants in it, blood thinners. I take blood thinners, so it's the same chemical in me, but 100 times more. Does a great job on rats. But what happens with these bigger animals is they eat those dead or those dying animals, and it accumulates in their system. It degrades their immune system so that they can't fight off simple things like the parasites that call mange anymore. They lose their hair, they can't keep warm, they itch so much that they can't sleep at night, and eventually is almost always fatal. And this doesn't just happen to coyotes, it's bobcats. It's mountain lions. P22, the famous mountain lion underneath the Hollywood sign, got this so bad that they had the wildlife biologists had to capture him and treat him and then return him to the wild in order for him to survive. And it also kills great horned owls and red-tailed hawks. All the animals that are natural pest control are impacted by these chemicals. So if you want to take a picture of this or just remember the name, this website has really great information about what rodenticides you can use that aren't as dangerous, what traps to use, other natural solutions. And they also have a list of the brands of the stuff that you shouldn't use. So you can check in your garage or with your gardener, hey, we're not using this stuff. Now the good news is that the state of California a few years ago passed a law that banned most of this stuff, and then just in September passed a new law that bans all of it, except for emergencies and agricultural landscapes. But, unfortunately, it's still out there.
Oh,
This picture here on the left is 2 weeks ago in our yard. And the ones on the right are a bobcat, the young bobcat, that was so compromised that I could walk 10 feet away from it in the middle of the day and it didn't really move away. So it's still out there, and I ask for all of your help, with your neighbors, with your gardeners, to try to get the stuff out of our world, because it really is hurting these animals. So now I'm going to move on to, I think, mostly what you want to hear, but with a little digression, because there would be no mountain lions in our community if we didn't have black-tailed deer. This is their main prey. 80+% of their diet is made up of these animals. And the reason they're in Burlingame, Hillsborough, Millbrae, Belmont, and Menlo Park, and all these communities is because we have 2 to 5 times more deer in our urban and suburban communities than in a natural landscape. Because we have fruit trees and irrigation and tasty flowers and all this stuff. The deer go crazy, and the mountain lions, especially the females with cubs, they make a calculation. They say, well, we don't like people, but there's a heck of a lot of food on the other side of 280, so that's where we're going to go hang out. Now, I kind of like deer in and of themselves too.
wow.
And primarily because they're kind of like a calendar. If you look at deer and how they kind of live throughout the year, you can tell the seasons. So here we go. This is spring, early spring. This is a mother deer, and she just had 2 little fawns less than 24 hours before. And already less than 24 hours old, they're already able to walk up and down that steep slope that I can't walk down. And they're also old enough to show that they're ticked off when mom wanders away for a little while, as this little one is doing, looking for his mother. Now here's another hardworking mom. About 5 days later, we got some late season rain, and she's acting as an umbrella for the new generation. So then we move on a little bit later into early summer. The fawns get bigger, they start eating leaves, but they still remember how good they have it, and they come back for more of that. And just listen to the sound effects here. That's my favorite part.
Later.
Now, poor mom can't even get a break at night. Here she is, I'm going to rest, I'm going to scratch my ear. But lo and behold, the 2 siblings come back for a sneak attack. And they come in for more, even though they don't need it anymore. And she says, well, I might as well give them a bath at the same time. So, always looking out for the next generation. Now, we get to late summer. These fawns are almost as big as their parents, but they still have spots. And they're starting to be teenagers or adolescents with all the energy and all the stuff that goes along with that. Now, this is the only clip. I tried to put music to this, and it was kind of a mistake probably. And I realized I'm not going to be a sound director in a movie anytime soon. But bear with me, because I do think it fits what happens with this young buck. get to this time of year, we're back in the fall and early winter, and you can see the fawns are up there on the left on the stairs. They don't have spots anymore. They're getting to be as big as their parents. And the big guys come back to start the cycle, to battle it out with each other and start the cycle all over again. And it's still kind of mind-blowing to me that like we have animals like that walking down the middle of our streets and in our neighborhoods. It's pretty cool. All right, so now we're finally on to the mountain lions. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that probably 90% of the people in this room were like, if I ever had an animal like that in my backyard, I would move or call the police or something.
No.
So, what is the risk? Well, there's a mountain lion whose story we're going to learn about in the next few minutes. And she probably spent 5 to 6 years east of 280, ranging from Millbrae down to San Carlos. 2,000 days and nights. And during that whole time, she was no more than 100 yards from anybody's house. And there was not one bad interaction with this mountain lion. In fact, in San Mateo County, in the last 40 years, there's been one attack, non-fatal, in the last 40 years. In 2022, 48,000 people in California were admitted to hospitals with dog bites. And 9 people died. So, yes, they're scary and they're big, but if you look at the numbers, there's not a lot that we have to worry about. They know, even more than coyotes, how to kind of keep their place in the world. So how many do we have? Well, these animals have giant territories, 30 square miles for the female, 100 for the males. And like bobcats, they will fight to keep other females away from their territory. What I've done here is I've drawn a dash box that shows, like, if you assume that one of these animals was only east of 280, how big would that territory would be? One female mountain lion could range all the way from San Bruno all the way down into Menlo Park. And a male, who also fight off other males, could cover the entire northern peninsula. So at any point in time, we maybe have 2, or maybe a mom with a couple cubs, like in the entire peninsula, you know, north, I'm talking about the developed part now, north of Palo Alto. So there aren't that many of them. If you see them around, or if people report them next to us, because they move around so much in their territory. Now, one night I was watching TV, and when we moved to this house, I never thought for a second that we'd have one of North America's like most fearsome predators in our backyard. I was watching TV with my daughter. My phone started buzzing. I was like, oh, it's the raccoon, or it's the possum, or maybe it's a bobcat. And I looked, and this animal wandered through the yard.
Nice.
So this is a giant, fully mature male mountain lion. I went out and I looked at that tree in the background, and it was about up to here. So this animal probably weighed 150 or 200 pounds. And just wandered right through our yard looking for who knows what. So unfortunately, about 10 days after this, there were reports of a police car in 92 hitting a very large mountain lion that managed to crawl off into the underbrush. And we never saw it again. So I fear that he probably met his demise on that night, because that's really the biggest threat to mountain lions in our community, is traffic. But a couple weeks later, somebody else wandered through. And this female mountain lion came back every 2 or 3 months for 2.5 years. And the rest of this is kind of the story of her life. She kicked the camera. So. I named her Luna after the Roman goddess of the moon because she never came out during the daytime, only at night. All right, so our skunk makes a return visit here. And when I first saw this, it was a very hot summer night, and the mountain lion ended up laying down on the ground. I was like, oh, she's just chilling in the shade and trying to cool off. When I put together all the footage, though, it was an entirely different story, as you'll see.
Uh-oh.
And I want you to focus right here.
She's gonna spray. Oh, see the eyes.
So there is Luna lurking in the background, maybe hoping she can make a quick meal of things. Now that's a view of a skunk we never want to see. For sure, the business end. But you'll see that Luna has other plans here.
This is great footage.
This is one night.
This was about 60 seconds of footage. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So what happened there, Luna jumped in, quick meal, gains up, sees me, skunk turns around, backs her up, she lies down on the ground, basically saying, I've seen your kind before, and I don't want anything to do with it, so I'm gonna lie down on my back. And as she walks away, the skunk comes towards her, and she hisses to say, like, hey, keep away. And after this encounter, oops, sorry, I messed up the footage there, but after that encounter, Luna went one way, the skunk went out the front gate with a few looks over his shoulder to make sure it was alone, and they both went on their merry way. So who's really the top predator in the peninsula? Probably the striped skunk. Now, the next few videos all show mountain lions hunting. And as I've already alluded to, they're really, really good at it. So you can imagine how this turns out. I'm not showing anything bad here tonight, keep it kind of PG-13, but you kind of know where things are going to go. So we were on vacation. I woke up one morning and I had like 50 little messages on my phone because this happened in the backyard.
What a week.
I want you to watch, is she going full speed or not?
No, it's not.
There goes the deer. There she goes behind. Deer stuck on a ledge, doesn't catch it. Walking around the yard, and here she comes once again through the camera. And the deer goes off and she's trotting on her way. Now, when I saw this, I thought maybe this is where I go beyond science, and my science colleagues at work could probably roast me for this, but I thought to myself, like, maybe she probably knows that, like, there are fences. And I'm convinced that this animal knows how to use fences to catch her prey, but there was also something else going on. Because she's not alone. And in the background is one of her two cubs. One didn't make it, but here is the second, a male, who, as you will see in a moment, is nearly full size, but is only about 9-10 months old. And here he is coming back during the daylight to where they had kind of stashed their meal. And I personally think that this was a training run where she might have been chasing this deer, hoping that he would start to figure out how to fend for himself. So next, the hunt happened on somebody else's property, but they used ours as a gateway to get back and forth over a few days. And here she is. She climbs up, looks back at the camera, and then in one leap jumps over a 6-foot tall fence.
Wow.
So if you think fences are going to keep mountain lions out,
No.
that is not the case. Deer, if you don't have deer, you probably don't have these guys. Now here's Junior, he's back. He didn't see how Mom got over the fence. And he's looking, he's like, can I get under? No. Can I get through? No. Not quite sure what to do. And he starts to express his displeasure with Mom. And he ends up walking back the way he came, probably taking the long way around. Now the interesting thing about this encounter is that he, the cub, came back by himself the next 3 nights. Every night, 9 o'clock at night, he'd go out. I opened the gate for him so he could get out. And then in the morning, he'd come back, 4 or 5 in the morning. And this is when he's dispersing, separating from his mom. This is like the hardest time in his life. He's going to be on his own. And his mom is still doing the heavy lifting, but leaving him for days at a time so that he can figure out how to exist out here. Now this next hunt, you will see her going at full speed, and you ask yourself, like, is this really the same animal that I saw earlier? But here's the third and final adventure. Here she senses as a deer. She starts going after it, and then makes a lunge. Now this was after, and the interesting thing about this is that she then proceeded to drag the deer from one end of our property to the other, over a fence, and who knows where. She had never done that before, and the 3 or 4 times this had happened over 4 years, she had never done that before. So I wondered, like, what is different this time? And a few days later, that question was answered. She had new cubs. Now, it's not normal for cubs this small to be out on their own, and so I was quite worried. But the next night, she came back, looking for them, and clearly knows where they are and is smelling them on the steps. And a few days later, found them. Or maybe even that night, but there were reports on next door up in Burlingame Hills that she was out and about with 2 cubs. And she gave me a gift that night, which is this photo. So I have a camera trap, it's a special camera. She walked right through it and gave me this gift of her walking out of the darkness. Now, unfortunately, that's the last photo I have of her. Because about a week later, she was hit by a car up on 280. Now, I was obviously sad. I mean, you know, kind of all the animals, bobcats, coyotes, kind of like animals that are in our yard 100 nights a year like a bobcat. The mountain lion is the one that had this arc, the story arc of like babies and training them and all this other stuff. And, you know, who would think a mountain lion? And that's the last thing I would think. But that was the case. So I had a lot of sadness, but it quickly turned to anger. Because it had been known for a long time that not only was 280 the most dangerous freeway in the entire state for mountain lions, but also for other wildlife. There's a research center at UC Davis called the Road Ecology Center, and they've been studying roadkill data across the entire state, thousands upon thousands of entries a year. and they analyze it all. And ever since 2009, 280 was either the number 1 or the number 2 most dangerous freeway in the state for animals. The other one that swapped places, 680 in the East Bay. So that's bad for animals, but people were getting hurt in all these collisions. So every other year somebody dies because they hit an animal on 280 and crash. And on average, every year, almost $6 million of damage is done. Through damage to the car, through medical bills, through lost work time. So this is one of those, in the conservation world, like, we're always looking for a home run, where we can protect animals and do great stuff for people. This is an example of something that should be fixed. And not only that, but Caltrans knew about this for so long that they funded a study back in 2013 to look at all the hot spots on 280. They know exactly where the problems are happening. And they paid the Road Ecology Center to figure out what to do about it. And the amazing thing is that we don't need wildlife overcrossings like they're building in LA for $90 million. We don't need that. We have San Mateo Creek that goes under the 280. We have Truesdale. We have Edgewood Road. We have all of these. We have culverts that go underneath. We even have fencing along most of 280, but that's the problem, not all of it. So the gaps in the fences are what let animals out onto the freeway, and when they get out there, they can't get back because it's partially fenced. So this solution to fix this would pay for itself in less than 2 years. $6 million of damage, probably cost about $5 or $6 million to do all 30 miles of 280. It would pay for itself in less than 2 years. So I think it's time. The state is spending hundreds of millions of dollars funding wildlife crossings. We just passed a climate change bond for $10 billion. I hope that you all join me tonight in starting a change.org petition and signing this petition, sharing it with your friends, so that we can convince Caltrans once and for all that the money's there, the need is there. Let's get this done. This is low-hanging fruit in the world of wildlife conservation, and it's good for all of us. It'll make our roads safer. So I'd be a really horrible storyteller if I left you with that. So what happened to the cubs? Well, a few days later, some Good Samaritans up off of Skyline in Burlingame found 2 little cubs wandering around. And they called the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they rescued them and brought them to the Oakland Zoo. And here's the rest of their story. So Maple and Willow ended up going to a zoo in Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts. It's an hour from my house where all my family still lives. And that's where they'll spend the rest of their days. But that is not the end of the story, because there's still another character who's still out there. So this is Junior. Remember last time we saw him, he was crying to get through the gate and had to go the other way. And he's grown up a lot in the last year. That fence is over 8 feet tall, and he just jumped right over it. And here he is, kind of marking his territory and claiming our yard as his own a few months ago. So with a little bit of luck, he is still out there as the top cat in our part of the peninsula. So that's the end of the story. I hope there are a few things that we can do to coexist with all these animals. Number one, keep your pets inside in the middle of the night. Number two, let's not use those rodenticides. They're horrible, and it's easy to find alternatives. Number three, when you're driving at night, it's easy to think that there's nobody on the roads and their bikes and the kids and the e-bikes are all gone for the night, but the animals are still out there, so pay a little more attention. And finally, number four, please sign a petition or email me about fixing 280. It's time for that to get fixed, and it's better for animals and for us. And I commit to doing everything in my power to make that happen.
Definitely.
Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is hopefully just kind of a new thought process, which is when you go outside at night and you see the moon, think about all of the drama and the stories that happen in the dark. The mothers doing everything they can to raise the next generation. The animals of different species that cross paths and do things that you'd never expect. The circle of life and death and life that goes on in the dark. Now, these animals have been living alongside people on the peninsula for over 5,000 years, as long as people have been here. And with a little help from us and all of our friends and family and colleagues out there, they could be around for another 5,000. Thank you very much.